Hello, my name's Harry. The talk I'm doing this afternoon is 4.5 methods for theming in SCSS. There are a couple of things I'd like to point out about this title. Firstly, 4.5. So we're going to look at theming and customization in UI projects, and theming and customization are very, very subtly different. So we've got 4 big kind of beefy theming topics, and then like an extra bonus customization thing in there. The second thing is the S, CSS, the S being in brackets. Just hands up, who uses a preprocessor in their work? Cool, right, so it's going to make sense for the majority of you. We'll also look at this in a few slides' time, but some of these demonstrations will require a preprocessor, in this case SAS. Some of them won't do. Bit of bonus trivia. This is the first talk I've ever given that has full, complete examples of CSS in them. It wasn't until I started putting this slide deck together that I realized every single talk I've given up until this point is kind of really theoretical, really high level. So yeah, a bit of bonus trivia for you there. I'm not sure what you're supposed to do with that. I'd like to say hello. It's a real privilege to be here in Helsinki. Thank you so much for inviting me. As soon as I got off the plane yesterday, you guys were the most polite people I've ever met. So round of applause for you guys. Round of applause for you guys. Second round of applause. Everybody in Helsinki is so good looking and they dress really well. So yeah, I mean, I'm probably going to move here now. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. So yeah, I'm Harry. I'm a consultant front-end architect from the north of England. The north of England is what explains this really weird accent. Hopefully you can actually tell what I'm saying. But I've got a real, like Yorkshire where I'm from, we say curd when we should be saying code. So the big O sound is something that we really struggle with. So yeah, curd blurt would be code bloat to a proper English speaker. Yeah, the consultant front-end architect bit, quite a sort of lofty, pretentious job title. I'll get that back onto that in a second. But before then, I've got a hashtag for this talk. Every talk I do, I try and give it a little hashtag, just because I really like to have some kind of real-time feedback, disagreements, alternative ways of working. If you guys have ever come up with an interesting theming problem, in your project, honestly, just start firing tweets out because I really like getting that kind of going and we can see in the room what everybody else's experience is, and then we can get a beer afterwards and talk about it together. So yeah, consultant front-end architect. This isn't me just being indulgent here, this has got a point. It's my job to go and meet new clients all the time and help them solve lots and lots of different problems. Usually that's to do with scaling CSS. Oftentimes it'll be performance related, front-end performance, responsive design and that kind of stuff. But having been working as a consultant for the last year and a bit, I've learned something that really surprised me. Theming is an incredibly common problem, incredibly common. I would estimate that in the last year and a half, 50 to 60% of my clients have had requirements and therefore problems with theming. Quick show of hands, anybody in the room work on a product or a site that requires any kind of theming or customization? So about 25 of you will like this talk. But this comes in different guises. So when I was working full-time, I did about 2 different theming projects, and they had the exact same problems, the exact same constraints. But since working with other clients, different types of clients, I've realized that theming is a huge, really sort of vast problem to be solved. I have clients who work software as a service. Anybody here work on a software as a service platform? Cool, so you might need to let your users customize that platform. Or you might need to actually, if your software as a service is specifically white labeling, you might have to give completely custom bespoke themes to your clients, right? So that's kind of doing bespoke theming or doing customization for a software as a service product. Hub clients, so this is a really terrible phrase. I couldn't think of anything more appropriate. But what I mean by a hub client is anybody who has a huge website that has different microsites within it, and each microsite has its own theme. A good example of this would be bbc.co.uk. So if you go to if you've ever been to the BBC website, you will see that BBC Sport is like a bright yellow, but BBC News is a really nice deep shade of red. So it's all under the same bbc.co.uk domain, but different subsections of that product, of that site, have their own kind of themes, their own branding. And finally, I've worked with a couple of social network clients, and these social networks want to offer customization. So we will, actually, this brings me nicely onto the next section. The difference between theming and customization is a fairly subtle but significant one in terms of how we implement it. So I've worked with a few social networks who actually want to be able to offer the ability to customize that platform. Okay, so very, very broadly speaking, the way I see UI design is that there are 3 levels. Firstly, we've got the design, right? The design is what we do. That's what the product looks like. Then we could have a theme that sits on top of that. So we could have a light theme, we could have a dark theme. On top of that, we have customization. So there are kind of 3 tiers. And what I'm going to cover now really briefly is just the difference, the subtle difference between the 2, because then it will make a lot more sense for the examples we're going to look at. So theming, as far as I see it, is defined by developers. Theming would happen in the company, in the dev company. So you'd have a designer who creates a UI, and then that designer might make 5 different versions of it, which means the developer has to then build 5 different skins. So theming is defined by developers. It requires a lot of developer input. The theme isn't done by the user at all. It's all done by the design and dev team, which gives us a finite amount of variance. It means that we might have 5 themes and that's it. We know exactly how many themes we have, which then gives us this nice aspect of we have some, like, we know what our rules and constraints are. We know that we can theme this, but not this. We can customize that, but not this. So that's a really nice thing for developers to work with. A fairly decent example of this, if you're familiar, I hope you're all familiar, with Jeremy Keith. You hit Jeremy Keith's website, on the right-hand side, you'll see this module here for choosing a theme. So Jeremy Keith at some point decided that, okay, I'm going to have 5 different themes for this website, and I'm going to let the user implement them. Right, so this is theming. Jeremy designed and developed the themes. The user had no say at all in them, but the user can implement them. Customization, on the other hand, is done entirely by the user. Customization is when developers aren't involved at all. Or rather, the developer might build a mechanism to allow the user to customize something, but after that, it's all in the user's control. This gives you infinite possibilities. Anybody who had a MySpace account, or anyone who remembers MySpace, will remember that every single MySpace website looked different, but they all looked bad. So typically, yeah, whatever the user says goes. This is customization. This happens after the developers have finished. This happens after the designers have decided what the theme is. So customization, a good example of this would be if you hit twitter.com/settings/design, you'll see down here, you can customize your own Twitter profile. And I imagine most of you in here have done this. Interestingly, this screenshot's really useful in that we can see we've got theming at the top. So Twitter's designers and developers decided that there are going to be 19 different background image themes you can have. But as well as that, you can customize it. So this shows us how you can layer theming and customization on top of the other. An interesting thing I thought I might do as well is, rather than just jumping straight into 4.5 different ways of theming, is actually to offer or share the advice that I would give to the client. So I often get clients getting in touch saying, we've got this requirement, we need theming, blah, blah, blah. And I will very rarely just go ahead and do some theming stuff, because I think, well, if you can avoid it, you definitely should. Unless you've got an actual business case for doing theming, I would tell a client just to not bother. If you have, for example, 5 different variants of one UI, that's 5 different things you have to build, 5 different things you have to look after, 5 different things you have to sort of troubleshoot and sort of check every time you make a change. So I always tell clients, unless there's an actual business case for theming, just don't bother. Jeremy Keith's website, it doesn't need that style switcher. I'm sure it doesn't lead to any more conversions, any more people getting in touch. So if you get a client wants their site, they need it theming, I would just advise them against it unless there's an actual business case for doing so. If there is a business case, and oftentimes there really is a business case, keep it simple. Always reduce the amount of complexity involved. I mean, this has just got advice for everything. But with theming, keep the theming as simple as you possibly can, and the best way to do this is just not to style any box model kind of stuff. Changing the background color on a button won't break your page's layout, but changing the padding of a button might do. So if you're going to do theming, just try and leave it as cosmetic as possible. Enforce rules. So one thing that happens all the time with clients who offer theming solutions to their clients is that their customer will say, oh yeah, can we theme this, 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 and can we have a custom layout for the homepage? Can we change this? Can we put that over there? Now that's going outside of the realm of theming, that's getting really complex, and that's adding deviation. I worked with a client recently who offered theming that was so bespoke that they actually had X hundred amount of the same homepage. For every single client they had a completely brand new homepage. It wasn't themed, it was completely custom. It meant that any changes to the core platform needed making 200 times. That's ridiculous, that's really expensive. But if your client is really, really, really certain that they definitely need a custom homepage that's completely not like anybody else's, tell them that, yeah, you can have that, but it's going to cost you 15,000 euro. Right? Pick a number that's big enough that they're going to say no, but also big enough that if they say yes, I mean, you've made some decent money. Okay, I promise this is the last bit of sort of groundwork before we actually start looking at these 4.5 different methods. I mean, we kind of covered this right at the beginning. Most of you use a preprocessor, so that's cool. We'll find that as we look at these examples, some of them just don't need a preprocessor. Some of them you can do, or you have to do with vanilla CSS. Some of them don't really need a preprocessor, but I've used one for kind of terseness, or just for kind of syntactic sugar. And some of them do need a preprocessor. But my advice would always be, if you're tackling theming, you should be using a preprocessor anyway. All of the examples in here that do use Sass, because it is specifically Sass that I'm going to be talking about, it just makes it so much easier to build and, more importantly, to manage. Okay, cool, right. Finally, the 4.5 methods, as promised. The first method is what I call the theme layer. Now, all of the names of these different methods I've completely invented. So if you think of a better version or a better name for them, again, we've got the hashtag, just fire it out there. The theme layer is probably the type of theming we're probably already the most familiar with. It's kind of the old school, any theming project that already exists and existed before Sass probably uses this method. And it's basically just adding more CSS to override kind of previous styles, adding new CSS to reskin something. Like I said, probably the most common current approach to theming. You've probably seen this all the time, right? You've got your default sort of vanilla UI, then you just add some more CSS after it to just override things. This is really well suited to certain things. So bespoke theming, this is really useful for that. If you've got a client who needs a completely customized UI, they need their branding applied to it, I'd recommend using something like this. It's really well suited to doing completely bespoke custom theming. On the file system, we could get that looking something like this. This method doesn't need a preprocessor at all. I'm using one for convenience here. And the naming convention you can see is just something that, so I have a CSS architecture called the inverted triangle CSS architecture. This is just the naming convention from that. Components.tabs just tells me, okay, well, this is a tabs file, and its styles are specifically related to the component aspect. And then, however many lines of Sass later, we're importing a separate file for these tabs called the theme layer. So we've got theme.tabs. We can take this as far as we want. We could have components.tabs, components.buttons, and again, a corresponding theme file for each. And as you can imagine, this would just look like this. I really don't need to spend too much time on this, and I'm pretty sure it makes perfectly good sense. What happens is, after this has been compiled and goes over the wire, the browser obviously doesn't need this one anymore, and the tabs are now red. The good aspects of this approach is you can swap layers out. So if you need to remove theming completely, just delete every theme.file. You can have theme.light.tabs, theme.dark.tabs, theme.red, theme.blue. So you can swap layers in and out really quickly. So it means you can actually add completely new layers of UI very, very rapidly. Now, another good thing is you can theme anything, right? Because we're typing brand new CSS, we can not just do colors, we could do font families, we could do font weights, we could do font sizes. Remember how I said we should avoid doing anything non-cosmetic? But at least with this method, we could, right? So if you have to change the width of something or the padding on something, because we're typing brand new CSS here, we can get at all those things to override them. I guess someone doesn't want me to do this talk. There we go. Yeah, so that's the good. The bad, lots of redundancy, right? Every single themed declaration, 50% of them will just get strike-throughs. 50% of them go over the wire and never get used. So there's a lot of redundancy here. Of course, we could probably use some tooling to get rid of that. But for the sake of this demonstration, this proof of concept, there's a ton of redundancy in here. Another potential negative is that this does split styling across multiple files. It's nice that you can get rid of all your theming in one go, but it does mean that anybody new to the project has to be aware that, oh, okay, right, so I've got to find some styles in the components layer and some styles in the theme layer. So we are actually splitting cosmetic rules across two different parts of the project. The next method, stateful theming. I really like stateful theming because you can do some really cool stuff with it. Anybody who follows me on Twitter may have seen me share a SassMeister URL with a proof of concept for stateful theming recently. You can do some really nice stuff with it. It's a very powerful method for theming a UI. And it's basically styling a UI based on a state or a condition. That condition can be invoked either by us, the developers, or by the user. So yeah, different skins based on conditions. And the key thing here is the themes are switched on the client, right? So the user actually sees the UI changing. So it isn't a case of we need to spin up a different version of the theme for us internally. This allows the user to see that change happen. Really well suited to style switches. So Jeremy Keith's website would or could use stateful theming and individually styled sections of a site. So I mentioned the BBC website with different sections in different colors. Actually got some screenshots here. Anybody who uses Trello will probably be familiar with this. In Trello, you can change the background color of your board's background image. By changing these colors, you're basically invoking a state. You're saying the state of the UI is blue, but I would like it to be green. The BBC website, hopefully you can see on this screenshot, if you look at the tabs at the top, every section of the BBC website has a different color. So here the user isn't changing the condition via a style switcher, the condition changes itself when the user heads into any of the parts of this site. The quickest way to solve this kind of theming would just be something like this. So this is using Sass. Anyone familiar with the parent selector will see what's going on here. The tabs are just grey. We've got some grey tabs. But if they live inside a context with a class of t-red, those tabs will become red. The t- is just a naming convention I use to signal to other developers that this class is purely to set up a theming context. This class doesn't do anything but set up a theme. It's the condition. Like I said, using Sass here to just transplant those classes in front of the tabs basically just means the tabs went in this context. Compiles out to something like this. Something exactly like this. Really straightforward stuff. All we need to do is turn that switch on. And the most conventional, common way of doing this would just be sticking a class on the body element. We can see here how we've just got class equals t-red. That's setting up the state. That's setting up the condition for this UI. Swap that out for t-blue, and the tabs will now be blue. So this kind of stateful theming is really good for style switches. If someone selects a different theme, and we can just put a new class on the body element. Someone heads into a different part of the website, programmatically we will add that class for them. So this sets up a completely sort of view-wide context. Now the cool stuff is when we get onto stateful utility classes. I kind of refer to these as decorators, and they'll crop up again later in the talk. Stateful utility classes is basically, it's a class that kind of acts a bit like a variable. So here we should see that we've got u-color-current. The u- is a fairly common convention for utility, or denoting a utility. What we've got here is basically a class called u-color-current, which just points at a different color depending on the context you're in. Using the parent selector again, we get this. So the value of color current varies depending on the state or condition you're currently in. Now, where this becomes really useful is if you've got a site like the BBC or Trello or Jeremy Keith's site, if you want to force a bit of the DOM to always track the current color, just decorate the UI with these classes. This is a class that just tracks the current theme. It's a decorator. So for example, we might have a page title component. We just drop that class on it to decorate the UI. That class will always just sort of resolve to the current theme. As we head through the site, we know that this bit of the DOM will always reflect the current condition. So T red, T blue. Good things about this is we can actually bundle a number of themes into one code base. We can send all these over the wire so that when someone uses the style switcher, it's good to go. It's already there. Let's see if this is a bit loose. Probably shouldn't touch it, I'll make it worse. So yeah, really good for style switchers. We can change the theme based on a condition on the client. The user sees this changing, or perfect for areas of a website. If a user heads into a part of your site that needs a different theme, this would be the perfect thing to use. The old version of The Guardian's website, like politics and news and sport were all different colors. This would have been a prime candidate for that kind of site. And again, we can theme anything. The bad is that we do actually bundle a number of themes into one code base. If nobody uses the style switcher, if nobody heads from one section of the site to the other, we've got a potential like a massive raft of just redundant CSS that didn't get used. Okay, so config theming, the third method. This is good for changing themes not on the client. If we want to change themes on the dev side of things, we could use config theming. It's basically recompiling a theme based on a setting that we have access to. So yeah, good for switching themes dev side, and we can just spin out the same UI with whatever theme we like. So let's say we've got one kind of skeleton default look and feel. We can switch a bit of config in Sass or less or stylus, which will recompile that UI with a different look and feel. So it's really good for spitting out differently themed variants for kind of off-the-shelf theming. So if a client comes to you or a customer wants to use your software platform, they want to buy a license to it, when they sign up, you can say to them, look, do you want a light theme, a dark theme? So you can have all these different themes just ready to go. So I've had clients who need this kind of thing, and they just want to be able to change their UI just by recompiling the CSS. Again, using the sort of layer.file notation, settings.config, we import that. And then however many dozen lines of Sass later, we import the components.tabs again. The absolute simplest, quickest way to get this up and running is just basically having a theme variable. Just having theme and set it to whatever you need. Then later on, you import that component file. And we're using tabs here. It could be buttons, it could be anything. And we just sort of sprinkle some logic in this Sass file to say, right, well, if the theme's red, do this, otherwise do this. And we can have any amount of bits of ifs and else's in there. If it's red, if it's blue, if it's light, if it's dark. We can actually take this up a little notch. We can actually make this a little more elegant. It's not really relevant for this talk, but I'll show you anyway. Just handle all your config in a Sass map. So we could have, what's the current environment? Is it dev or is it live? You could have this file that lives on your CI, which might tell, it's live, therefore point to these file paths. And a simple function to grab this stuff out of this Sass map. I will share a zip file of all these proof of concepts later on, so if you want to fiddle with this, you can do. And yeah, it looks pretty much the same, but instead of just if theme equals red, we grab the theme key from the config map, and then we just do the same thing. If it's red, do this, otherwise just fall back to grey. Good things about this method is we only send as much CSS over the wire as we actually need. Because we're actually compiling the CSS ourselves, and SAS does all the checks, it means that we don't send all the themes over the wire. So it means that the CSS is only ever as big as it needs to be. We can completely change the theme or the look and feel of the UI from one location. We just head into that settings file, change the context, recompile, and we get a brand new version of the UI, which means we can have those themes just sat on a shelf waiting to go. We can just implement those every time someone requests one. I've had clients actually do this in their CI as well, so people can actually use a style switcher in an admin panel, and they will have a CI sort of job which will recompile that client SAS. So it means that the client doesn't have to stay with a light theme forever. So you can actually do this in a CI environment and have the SAS recompile itself. And again, we can theme anything. We're writing brand new CSS inside those if blocks, so we could theme font sizes. We don't have to stick to just theming colors. The bad is obviously there's just tons of logic in your SAS. Your SAS is now full of ifs and elses. It's very cumbersome to work with, not very pleasant to look at. You could take it further and write a bit of a mix-in perhaps to wrap around this stuff. But again, for this proof of concept that I've just shown you, that's a current problem, lots of logic. It only supports a finite number of themes. So if you've got 5 themes, you'll have 5 ifs and elses. And all the theme information, even though you can change it from one place, you change it from the settings file, the information is spread right throughout the project. It would make it very hard to unpick or remove theming. And it also means that adding a theme would be very, very laborious. For every themed bit of UI, you would have to open that partial, add another else or if block, and adding new themes takes a long time. Cool. Theme palettes. Now, these are really cool. I've used these quite a lot on a number of projects. A theme palette just allows us to take all of the brand settings, all of the theme settings, front load them into one SAS file, one settings file, and kind of store all that information up front, ready to be reused later on. I've got a really good example of this, which I'll try and hit upon. I think we should have enough time. So yeah, we hold the entire theme information in one palette file. The palette, as its name suggests, is to do with colors, because, like I said at the beginning, we need to try and keep theming as cosmetic as possible. So yeah, like I say, front load all this stuff, get all the information you need, store it in one config file, and then we inject these settings into the project later on. So it means that the previous method had logic all throughout your project. This method just injects it, so we keep the logic away from the rest of the project and just use its output. This is really well suited to fully bespoke theming. So if you get a client who wants a copy of your software as a service, your white labeled product, and they send their brand guidelines, their designer gets in touch and you create a fully bespoke theme so that their version of your white label platform looks exactly like theirs. This is the kind of thing you would use. I worked with a client in Romania at the beginning of this year, and they'd built a really complex, very impressive real estate kind of search engine. And people like Sotheby's, the auction house, would get in touch and they'd say, right, we would like a copy of your search engine, and we'd like it to just be branded completely like Sotheby's. So for this kind of project, we ended up using a theme palette. Looks a bit like this. So again, we've got the settings dot pattern. So we've got a settings.palette file, and then an arbitrary amount of lines of SAS later. Once again, we're bringing our components in. Really pared back version of what this might look like. We start off with what I call sort of literal variables, in semantically named variables. So in this project, the shade of red that it uses is just red. It's the CSS keyword red. What we then do in the same settings.palette file is we reassign color red onto color tabs background. Now the importance of doing this is so that we're not using color red all throughout the project, because as soon as the client wants the tabs to be blue, we'd have to change color red in every single instance. What we do here is we daisy chain our variables back onto semantic ones. This is basically the exact reason why we don't use classes like class equals red. What we do is we set up a load of literal variables and just daisy chain them onto semantic variables that we then implement later on in the project. This means that if the value of red ever becomes hash C00, that change happens once. The daisy chaining sort of propagates through. We've never had to go into this file and the background color's changed. So it means that we can keep all of the logic, all of the changes out of the project. This is also really good for doing open source things. So let's say that you release an open source project and you want users of that project to be able to customize it. You don't want them to edit the tabs file directly because that would sort of break the dependency. They wouldn't be able to update the project if they actually edited its files directly. So storing all the logic in this kind of daisy chained settings file allows you to inject those settings later on. Expand on it a little more. You might get a client who gets in touch, who wants to use your white labeled product. You would ask them, okay, send me your brand guidelines. Tell me what your brand colors are. Tell me everything about your branding. And you just populate this file here, reassign all the variables, and then these just get injected later on. The links will always be whatever the brand color is. But if the brand color changes from badass to coffee, we can do that. It doesn't actually affect any of the rest of the project. So I mentioned the open source thing. I built a project for the NHS. The NHS is England's National Health Service. They deal with doctors and nurses and the hospitals and the doctors' surgeries and that kind of thing. We built a big e-learning platform for them. Now, the British government have recently brought in this kind of, I don't know if it's law or legislation yet, but anything that the government pays for out of the taxpayers' money should be open sourced. So if the taxpayer paid for it, the government should open source it. So one of the conditions of building the UI for this e-learning platform was that it needed to be made open source. So I implemented this theme palette to use the NHS's brand guidelines. But then if another part of the government agency wants to use this, all they have to do is edit one file and it completely recompiles to be on their brand. The good, zero redundancy, because we're not actually writing any extra CSS, we're just injecting stuff in. The CSS project stays as small as it needs to. Perfect for bespoke theming. Just plug the client's brand guideline information in. We can completely restyle the project from one file. So the previous method, we could change the theme from one file. This one, we can completely re-theme it. So we don't actually spread any logic throughout the project. The bad, I mean, to be honest, there isn't really anything bad about this method. We are limited to mainly theming colors, but as we said right at the beginning, that's a good thing, right? We don't want to be editing box model stuff. There are certain things, like you could write a kind of a variable which would be $links underline false, perhaps, and then have a little bit of logic in your Sass to toggle underlines on links. But yeah, we are limited to mainly just theming colors. Cool, the next and the final tip is for user customization. This is like the little half tip. This lets users style their own UIs, right? This is when the developer doesn't actually have a say in what things look like. The user does all that. So user customization, it lets users kind of have their slice of this platform. My Twitter, for example, is CSS Wizardry Pink. And it's usually done through a CMS or an admin interface. It'd be very, very rare for the app to expose CSS. You certainly could do, but usually you get given like an admin interface with a hex field, like a color picker, and then that information just goes into the database. So it requires very little developer input. Really well suited to social networks. Like I said, Twitter.com, prime example. Software as a service platforms. So I worked with a client recently who had this great big software as a service tool. They had 10,000 customers. Now obviously it's completely impractical to offer theming for 10,000 customers. So they wanted a way for the customer to do their own theming. So then we implemented what I'm about to show you, which is user customization. It allowed the user to brand their own software without the developer having to be involved at all. I really like this method of user customization because it's really, really ugly, really unconventional, and just looks a bit weird. All the wrong reasons to like something as a developer, but I'll see what you guys think. I mentioned decorators earlier on. It's the exact same deal. What we do is we take that input from a CMS, we stick it in the database, then we just pull it back out of the database and just stick the information the user gave us, stick it straight in the DOM. What we can see here, we've got these these helper classes. This red here is what the user put into the CMS. So we just stick this all in the view. It's really ugly, really unconventional, incredibly pragmatic. So drop all the hex values or drop all the color values that the user inputs into a style block in the head of the page and bind onto utility classes. The good thing about this, using utility classes, or rather, let me back that up a bit. You probably noticed that we didn't have .tabs background color red, .btn background color red, .dropdown background color red. That would lead to a much bigger style block, and also it'd be quite hard to keep track of, right? If you ever change the class .tabs to .tab menu, you'd have to remember to change that back in this style block. Also, the second good thing is binding onto utility classes gives us these decorators. It means that as a developer, we can safely opt into customization. If we decide we want the user to be able to customize the background color of drop-downs, we just put a decorator. We put u-user color background on that bit of the DOM. So every bit of customization we opt into safely. It really reins back just how much the user can affect and also lets us see exactly what's being colored in. So yeah, we just sprinkle these helper classes all throughout the DOM. We want the tabs to be the user's background color. We use this. Now, this is actually a method that Twitter use. Any of you who've got customized Twitter profiles, this is what Twitter used to color those in. Specifically, Nicholas Gallagher. When I was doing my research for this talk, I did a view source on, I'll zoom in a bit. I did a view source on my Twitter profile, and I saw these, and straight away I was like, that looks like something Nicholas would have done. You guys know Nicholas Gallagher, normalize.css? So I sent Nicholas a DM. I was like, dude, this looks like you. This is ugly. This was you. And he's like, yeah, that was me. And I think it's phenomenal. I think it's brilliant because it just shows you how practical and pragmatic and quick it is to implement user customization. So the good is it requires zero developer input. Apart from the initial bit of setting this mechanism up, the user does all the customization. You don't get pestered to just change the hex value of this. The user can do that themselves. It adds a bit of business value. It lets the user kind of have their bit of twitter.com. It probably increases engagement because it's branded how they want it. It probably allows them to use it, or it probably convinces them to use it more. And yet, like I said, incredibly pragmatic. Who here works in-house on a product? So you probably value the idea of pragmatism quite highly. Just the idea of, look, let's just get this done. I've not got time for this. Just get it done. This is a really good example of that. It looks really unconventional, these kind of in-semantic classes, but it works, and it works really quickly. The bad, it requires zero developer input. There's nothing to stop a user putting white text on a white background. We could end up with the next MySpace, right? We could end up with loads of ugly UIs. So it does mean that we can't be in control of the look and feel as much as we'd like to be. Once again, we get lots of redundancy. Whatever the default theme was is now getting overridden by whatever the user said. So it means there's potentially wasted CSS going over the wire. And it's not even really CSS. We're losing the ability to cache these styles because we're dropping them in the DOM. We're dropping them in the view. My Twitter profile hasn't been reskinned since 2009. So since 2009, none of this CSS wizardry pink has been cached. Now, of course, if we start to think about pragmatism, actually taking the input from the user, sort of writing it to a style sheet, saving it to the file system, linking it up in the head and hashing it so we can cache bust it, actually creating CSS files out of this would probably be overkill. So I think the most pragmatic solution is just to drop this in the DOM. Okay, the last thing I'd like to hit upon then is when do we use which one? We just blitzed through those fairly quickly. So there's a real simple checklist of when to actually employ which method for the kind of task you have to solve, the kind of problem your product has. Okay, so the first question you want to ask yourself is who's actually doing the styling? Is it us, the dev team, or is it the user? If the answer is that it's the user, then straight away you need user customization. You can't really do a theme dev side and have the user customize that. So yeah, if it's if the user's doing the styling, you need user customization. Do you need the themes to change once they're on the client? Do you need the user to be able to see that these themes are changing? If that's the case, you need either stateful theming or user customization again. If the user has to be aware that the UI has changed, you need to use one of these two. More specifically, if the themes are toggleable, if the user can change the themes using a style switcher, if that's how the user sees the change, you want stateful theming. Right? If you've got a style switcher, stateful theming is the one to go for. Do you have sections of a site that need to look different? So the BBC is like the example I've used all along, but if anybody knows a guy called Paul Lewis, AeroTwist, fantastic performance engineer on Google's DevRel team, he's got a really, really beautiful website, and every section's a different color. So his homepage might be green, but his blog posts might be like purple, his about page might be blue. So yeah, different sections of a site. Again, we need stateful theming, this idea of setting up a context and styling the DOM off the back of that. Do you have a number of preset themes that a client can choose from? Do you have 5 kind of off-the-shelf available options that a client picks once? If that's the case, you need config theming, the idea of just spitting out the same UI, but with a different skin based on a setting. And finally, do you offer completely bespoke theming? Do you work on a white label platform where the customer gets to decide what the branding looks like? If that's the case, you either want the theme layer, right, just writing more CSS, or the slightly more elegant, or rather vastly more elegant, theme palette. The idea of front-loading all of your client's branding into one settings file. Hello? And injecting that later on. I'm really near the end, so I can do it without a mic. Very near the end. Thank you very much for listening. The slides for this talk are already live. If you hit speakerdeck.com/CSSwizardry, the slides are already there. I don't know if we're taking questions, but I'll try and leave this slide up for as long as I can so you can take pictures of it. There's a proof of concept of each of the methods in a zip file at this URL. It's csswizardry.net, not .com, so just watch out for that one. And yeah, completely shameless. We've had marketing guys doing this, so I'm going to do it. I'm really enjoying solving theming for clients at the moment. I'm finding a really fascinating sort of micro area of the front end sort of world. If you need help doing it, get in touch. I mean, I'm currently really enjoying it. I've got plenty of different ways of solving it. So yeah, get in touch. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone.